So yeah, my name is Daniel Pinchbeck, and I'm an author. I wrote a few books. My first book was called Breaking Open the Head, a psychedelic journey into the heart of contemporary shamanism. And my second book is 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And so what I usually do is I sort of talk about my journey to the present moment and the work I'm doing now. So so basically, Breaking Open the Head started when I was in my late 20s. I was working as a journalist in Manhattan, and I came from a sort of a cultural background, but not a spiritual background. My parents were secular materialists, artists, but they'd rejected kind of the religions of Christian Judaism of their families, and like a lot of people in my culture in New York. And in my late 20s, I was working as a journalist, and I was starting to write about ecological subject matter. I wrote a piece for Esquire magazine about why the human sperm count is going down. It turns out that the sperm count has gone down like 50% in the last 50 years, and discovered that had to do with plastics and pesticides and so on. And I wrote that piece, and then I just became more and more kind of fascinated by the ecological aspects of what's happening on the planet. And I found that the magazines, for the most part, were very not interested. And even there was almost a tone of kind of like cynical repudiation or ridicule if you tried to talk about a lot of serious material in the media. And that kind of period of my life kind of also was, other things were happening. I'd started a literary magazine with a friend who died of a heroin overdose. And I don't know, I just began to go into kind of a spiritual crisis, spiritual emergency. And at that point, I kind of asked myself, all right, like I'd grown up in this materialist culture, but did I know that materialism was, the only thing there was? Was there any access to any other types of consciousness or forms of consciousness? And at that point, I remembered some psychedelic experiences that I'd had in college. And I decided that I would make that a focus of my investigation, because I remember those experiences as being very significant on many levels, in giving me the sense that there were other levels or dimensions of psychic experience, of consciousness, and also kind of a deconditioning. I remember the first time, how many people here have taken a psychedelic, just out of curiosity? Well, I remember the first time, so that's not very many actually. The first time I took mushrooms, one of the initial experiences I had was the sense of like, how artificial all of our human-made constructs are, that we sort of accept that like money and cement buildings and cars are basically like natural things that are just like what they have to be. And suddenly all of those things, the artificial aspects of human society, seemed very kind of ludicrous in a way, like just these transitory constructs, and anything that was natural, like a tree or a plant, seemed to have a lot more design wisdom kind of inherent in it. I remember going into a store and trying to use money to buy something and laughing, finding it just ridiculous that our culture puts so much value on these little pieces of paper that were so ugly in a way, especially in the US. They're prettier here. So anyway, in my late 20s, I had this spiritual crisis, and I decided that I would go on this kind of odyssey to learn about shamanism and psychedelics. And I got some assignments. I was lucky enough as a journalist to be able to get assignments to go to exotic countries and take strange drugs. So I went to West Africa to work with a tribe called the Bwiti in a country called Gabon. And I went through a tribal initiation there, taking a substance called iboga. How many people here know about iboga, out of curiosity? So yeah, I mean, I could take a whole 2 hours just to talk about the psychedelic aspect of this, which it seems like would actually almost be useful here. But iboga, also known in the West as ibogaine, is kind of a sacrament. It's the only sort of full, kind of tryptamine-like psychedelic that you find in Africa and West Africa. And it's now being used in the West as a treatment tool for addiction, for heroin addiction and cocaine addiction, probably heroin above all. But it's a very long-lasting trip. When you eat it in a ceremony, it lasts for like 20 hours. There's many different phases of it. During my experience, I went back kind of through a lot of my early childhood memories. It was almost like the plant had a kind of guiding intelligence or a spirit that was showing me very intentionally kind of aspects of my life, how I'd been constructed as a person, the forces that had pressed me into a certain shape, like my parents' divorce and illnesses I'd had and stuff. And it was a very shocking and profound experience. But the ultimate result of seeing kind of these scenes of my life and being replayed, even early childhood feelings and scenes that I'd forgotten, was a sense of freedom, a sense that even though I'd been constructed in this way, that on another level I had total freedom to reinvent myself, and if I could find my will, I could turn myself into almost anything. So that was a really amazing experience. And then I also went down to the Amazon in Ecuador and visited a tribe called the Sequoia and worked with a substance called ayahuasca, which I assume more people have heard of. Ayahuasca? How many people? So ayahuasca is the sacred medicine of the Amazon rainforest. It's so funny because my Breaking Open that actually came out in 2002, and I remember when the book first came out in the U.S. and maybe England, like very few people had heard of ayahuasca, and then over the last few years, it's gathered tremendous force of interest and become a kind of a cultural phenomenon in the U.S. And now everybody knows about it, and Lindsay Lohan I think has taken it, and it's become like a chic celebrity kind of thing in a weird way. But yeah, which I think is good actually. I mean. Ayahuasca is a very powerful psychedelic, very transformative, and I was very lucky and privileged to be able to do it with this tribe in the Amazon who live very, very simply and have a tradition that goes back thousands of years. You kind of drink it in an all-night ceremony where you're in these hammocks in a kind of temple space, and the elders of the tribe all sing together, and they sing these kind of spirit songs, these very eerie and unusual songs. And they're kind of like a guiding device. So you're in this visionary state, and you're seeing these different types of beings, and the songs kind of lead you through these other realities, these other dimensions. And the elders would stop every now and then and check in with each other, and they'd be like, "Oh, like, are you seeing the blue people right now?" And it's like, "Yes, I'm seeing the blue people." And they'd be like, "Okay, great. Like, we know we're all in the same visionary space, so we'll keep going." So it really, with both these experiences, I began to recognize there was like a really profound knowledge system and in a sense a spiritual technology that these shamanic cultures possessed that was something that I had never imagined would be so advanced. Because our vision in the modern world is we're kind of told that kind of tribal people have a very primitive knowledge and a primitive way of understanding things compared to us. And a number of experiences that I had in these contexts with indigenous people really reversed that on me and made me think in some ways they were more advanced in their way of relating to the natural world around them and their way of relating with each other and in the depths of their spiritual connection and their spiritual practices. So I did this experience with the Sequoia. And then another thing about going there was going to the Amazon in Ecuador. We passed through all these sections of the Amazon which have been deforested, strip mined, where they found oil, and they built these, kind of roads to get into the oil sites, and they polluted the rivers and so on. And we began to learn. I mean, I had never really understood. I think it's very powerful to actually go to these places and experience it firsthand to fathom the rapidity of the destruction, and also you would see these huge tracts of the Amazon, thousands of acres, which. When they found oil, it would keep the U.S. supply of oil going for like 2 or 3 days maximum, and then the rainforest doesn't regrow and so on. So that was really the point where I already had this interest in the ecological subject, but I began to really think that humanity had gone on a really wrong path in some sense and had put itself on kind of like a suicide mission in a way. So that led me to writing the first book, Breaking Open the Head. I also visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico, where psilocybin mushrooms were rediscovered in the 1950s, and I wrote about LSD and modern chemicals, research chemicals, experimental chemicals, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna. Have people here beamed into Terence McKenna's work at all? Yeah, he was like the big psychedelic philosopher of the 80s. As I got into his ideas and other people's ideas, I began to learn. There was a lot of focus on 2012, which still seemed pretty far away at that point, as kind of the end of the Mayan calendar. And Terence McKenna had this experience in the Amazon in the 70s, where he'd had all these visions around it, and this other writer, Jose Arguelles, had also had all these visions. And they'd link these to this long count calendar of the classical Mayan civilization in the Yucatan. And If you go and visit those Mayan sites in the Yucatan, they're very extraordinary. And once again, this idea that that was a primitive or a backward culture seems to be totally absurd when you go to a place like Palenque or Teotihuacan in New Mexico City, and you see the level of their construction and the elegance, the genius and the aesthetic beauty behind it, and that somehow these giant temple complexes were kind of like places where shamanism was being done, large-scale rituals. They were like magical technologies that maybe we don't even understand yet or have a way of understanding. They're so different from our way of understanding and our mindset. So that was kind of the genesis of the second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. It was in that book, both those early books were really combined my own personal journey of exploration and discovery with kind of philosophy, anthropology, sociology, like cultural studies and so on. It was kind of, I had to invent my own genre in a sense. And with the 2012 book, I put a lot of effort into kind of correlating the way that these indigenous cultures see the world and see the spiritual worlds, I guess, even with Western thinkers, visionaries, and philosophers ranging from Heidegger and Nietzsche to Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner. I mean, at that point, I totally shifted in my worldview from being a kind of secular materialist to becoming somebody who recognized that, more like a Jungian perspective, that there is a kind of collective psyche, there's archetypal processes happening in the collective psyche, that I had so many psychic experiences myself that I had to accept that consciousness was not just based in the brain, as scientists tend to believe, but that actually it was more of like an immanent property or a shared phenomenon. Just out of curiosity at the Conscious Club, how many people here have had some type of psychic experience, synchronicity, or anything like that? How many people here still are essentially scientific materialists and believe that most people have sort of shifted from that, except for that one guy in the back. We'll talk later. Anyway, so that was 2012, and in the book I didn't say that anything drastic or traumatic or ecstatic was going to happen on December 21st, 2012, but I more saw that it was that we were approaching a transition in human society and culture and consciousness. And that I felt there was validity to this understanding that the cultures like the Maya had, and the Hopi in Arizona, who I visited, were like the most ancient tribe in the United States. And I think if we step back, we can see that we are at this time of it's like a pressure cooker with all these forces like coming together, and probably most kind of predominant is the ecological crisis that we're undergoing, which Kip talked about. I definitely, I'll go into this in a second, but so we can look at maybe a number of these things that began to, as I thought about it and studied it, began to feel that they represented, the idea that we're going through a shift in world ages, or as somebody like the Hindu talk about, or worlds, as the Hopi and the Maya talk about. The Hopi talk about the age of the fourth world to the fifth world. The Aztecs and the Maya talked about the age of the fifth sun and the age of the sixth sun. And I think there are a number of things that suggest that something like that is happening. It may be a 100-year process, which is just a blink of evolutionary time. But one of those is obviously the ecological crisis, which is already beginning to come to a head, and is going to become something that I think becomes much more part of all of our daily awareness and consciousness in the next few years. I mean, another aspect is the evolution of technology, which has now meshed us together as a species into one global brain. And another, I think, is the rediscovery of all these different world's esoteric traditions, from Indian mysticism, Vedanta and yoga, to Western Kabbalah, Sufism, to the indigenous shamanism traditions. That these are all different pathways that we can use to transform our consciousness, to enter non-ordinary states of consciousness, to experience the sort of vast dimensions of consciousness, which our modern culture has kind of really put a lid on and limited us from exploring up to this point. So after doing that book 2012, which covered a lot of crazy subjects, I talked about the crop circles that appear in England in there, and psychic phenomena, as I mentioned. I looked at research into psychic phenomena at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California, which has done a really great job. Dean Radin has done a great job of verifying, kind of psychic phenomena, looking at centuries worth of experiments and research and so on. Yeah, that book has sort of led me in many different directions. I actually made a documentary called 2012 Time for Change, which is up on Vimeo for free. You can all check it out. And that film sort of looked at this idea that of the Mayan prophecies of us in this transition of world ages, and then talked about different ways we could enhance our consciousness or evolve our consciousness using yoga, meditation, shamanism, ayahuasca. We had Sting in the film talking about his ayahuasca experiences. But then also looking at solution-based approaches to the planetary crisis. And among the ones that we touched on in the film were permaculture, bioremediation, which is our ability to use kind of natural plants and microorganisms, fungi and so on to take care of the toxins that we've released into the atmosphere, into the earth and so on. Particularly looking at the work of somebody named Paul Stamets, who works with mushrooms and has done a lot of, kind of is able to leach oil spills with, mycelial, and sort of, he's very fascinating. He talks about mycelia as kind of like the Earth's internet that's able to communicate underground under these vast distances. And we also looked at the possibility of, looking at alternative currencies as a means of, elevating or shifting human society through the work of Bernard Lietaer, who's also super interesting. Anyway, so we didn't want to just present the crisis, we wanted to also present the possible antidotes and the ways forward. And then I started a company, I started a web magazine, which is still going, called Reality Sandwich. And since then, that book came out in like 2007. I've been working on my next book, which I finally have finished to my great joy. And also, it's kind of strange to have worked on a book for 7 years and be done with it, and sort of like, who am I if I'm not writing the book? I'm not quite sure yet. But the book is really, looking at the ecological crisis as a kind of initiation for humanity. And this idea of initiation is something that you find in tribal cultures and traditional cultures around the world, right? Like most cultures up until the modern culture had rites of passage for young people, adolescents, maybe young men in particular, but also young women. For instance, the Aboriginals here would have walkabouts and so on. And basically, we tend to think of, once again, our modern construct is that these initiations are just these cultural events. They're they kind of have a cultural meaning, but it's also possible, as some people like Joseph Chilton Pearce have looked at, that they might have almost like a neurophysiological or function. That if you look at our sort of constructs of our brains, we have different structures in the brain, and the one that's developed most recently is the neocortex, right? And that's really the one that makes us distinctively human. It's developed in the last 100,000 years or so, and what allows us to use language, plan for the future, and so on. But in daily life, the neocortex is often a very small, subtle voice compared to the amygdala, which is kind of the flight or fight response, the fear and fight back or resist or detach or whatever. And so what may happen during these initiation processes in traditional and tribal cultures is by going through some kind of ordeal, which could involve like fasting or with a sun dance in the native cultures where you're actually hung by hooks into your pectoral muscles from a tree, or by doing ayahuasca or peyote or mushrooms. The sort of candidate for the initiation is put into a situation where they have to kind of overcome their normal ego-based consciousness, and see they have to reach a transpersonal state of consciousness where they recognize that they're not just their individual egoic self, they're actually connected to the natural world, to the cosmos, to the tribe, and when they're brought back from that experience, they're able to be full adults because they kind of know their place in the cosmic order. And they're able to be full adults, that they're able to be responsible for the collective, for the whole. And if you look at a lot of these traditional and tribal cultures, they had often have a negligible impact on the local ecology, or even a beneficial impact. So modern culture, by robbing us of those kind of initiatory experiences, in a way left us, most people as kind of kidults, rather than adults, where they're focused on their own, short-term success and egoic, desires, but they're not able to kind of, overcome those short-term desires for the collective interests of the whole. And if you look at, the sort of ecological crisis, it's almost the collective expression of a billion individual acts, right, of disconnection and self-interest and so on. So on the one hand, I think that this ecological crisis, in a way, maybe humanity has subconsciously self-willed it, because we've certainly known that it was on its way for a long time, to force us into a collective shift of consciousness, a transformation of consciousness. And it is unfortunate that it may have to take such a drastic turn. And I want to keep things upbeat, but I mean, he already went through some of the statistics, but we know that we're losing 150 to 200 species roughly a day, according to UN, out of 8.7 million species that are on the planet. So that means we're losing like roughly 10% of the biodiversity on the planet every like 10 to 15 years, and that's happening because a lot of the devastation is happening in tropical rainforests and places that really have such amazing amounts of biodiversity. We know that the oceans are now 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago because they're absorbing a lot of the CO2 that we're pushing into the atmosphere. We're pushing out about 1 million tons, I think, per hour. And so we're creating this enormous burden on the planet. And now we know that we're approaching tipping points through these positive feedback loops. So like the drought in California is leading to massive wildfires happening all in the Northwest, and then the forests, which were originally stores of carbon and were holding carbon, become releasing carbon in large scale. We're losing the albedo effect in the Arctic, where the ice used to reflect the sun. Now, as the ice melts, the water is absorbing the sun and heats up. So the Arctic is heating faster than the rest of the planet. And there's even more danger. And so what we've learned in the past is that there are these tipping points in climate systems where you could have a rapid acceleration of warming, which makes things like agriculture very difficult and could exacerbate all the tensions that we're already seeing around the world. So once again, I mean, going through initiatory processes, whether through medicines, shamanism, or through meditation or yoga, I think is going to become more and more essential for us to stay cool and calm and collected and find our peace and our harmony as the things in the world are changing more and more rapidly. And we're really going to have to undergo a shift from the current sort of hyper-individualism that our culture has, kind of constructed around us as a kind of shell, and break through that into going back to some type of cooperation, collectivism, kind of community-based resiliency, as kind of a model for how we're going to coexist. So on the one hand, I look at this ecological crisis as an initiation for humanity to undergo collectively, and on the other hand, I think that it's also an awakening into an awareness that we're actually kind of a planetary superorganism. Humanity as a whole constitutes a planetary superorganism that's in a symbiotic relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system, right? So I mean, that's just becoming more and more obvious to people. Does it make sense to people? Yeah. I feel it's nice to say, so I'll say it again. I feel that we're on the cusp of awakening to a realization that we are a planetary superorganism, in a sense, one species being that's in a symbiotic relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system, right? Now, as we make that shift in consciousness, and nobody can say how this is going to happen yet, but it's going to have tremendous impacts on our social systems, on our socioeconomic and political systems, and so on. And actually, if you look at the sort of history of biological evolution, our once again the modern construct of Dawkins and these people who've kind of abstracted one little aspect of Darwinism to talk about the survival of the fittest, and that kind of evolution is based on competition and aggression and domination. That actually turns out to be a very thin layer, and that actually on a much deeper level, the process of evolution is based on symbiosis and cooperation. And we have an incredible example of this. All of us have it very close at hand, which is our own bodies, right? So our bodies were once these vast colonies of microorganisms that were competing against each other in a different environmental scenario for scarce resources. And they learned in the process of a crisis that they could work together to form more complex structures, like skin and bones and eyes and so on. So our bodies are this tremendous example of symbiosis in action. And really, if we think about, our Earth today, it's incredible how much, coordination is taking place without us being, aware of it. When I buy a cup of coffee in New York, the beans are from Africa, the cup is from China, the oil that's made the cup is from Russia. Basically the whole world is now invested in that one act of buying something very simple like a cup of coffee, and I'm sure it's the same here. But the problem is that we've kind of developed in this kind of inertia of this historical process, right? That took us from, the monarchies and empires and the sort of domination cultures of colonialism and imperialism, and we're still stuck in this old mentality. I mean, but if we were able to break through it, as Kip said in the film, we could all start. One of his interviewees said in the film, we could all stop eating meat tomorrow. I mean, that's available to us as a possibility. We could also, eliminate all of the unnecessary industries on the planet, which we know we must do because otherwise we're not going to be here in a few decades, right? So we're really at this crux point, this crux of human evolution, where we have to shift from kind of the unconscious inertia of what's happened in the past to becoming conscious and aware of the whole system that's created us, that's given us this tremendous opportunity and this tremendous responsibility now to shift what we're doing and take care of the community of life around us. Does that make sense? All right, cool. And I've got 10 more minutes. Okay, so essentially in the new book, that's the basic model. It's on the one hand, we're undergoing a collective initiation. There's nothing we can do about it. We can't run away from it at this point. There's no hiding. There's no reason to distract ourselves anymore. We're just, the longer that we wait to face it, the worse it's going to get, right? I mean, it's obvious. So, anything that we can do now to begin to reduce our burden on the earth, to learn how to work together again, to build community, to learn some of the sustainable practices of indigenous people, that's all going to be a kind of imperative. And it's also going to be kind of like a happy birthday of humanity, because we're at this point, we're trapped in these kind of ossified structures that really aren't serving our growth anymore. And it's only through crisis that transmutation or mutation can arise. One of the beautiful metaphors or symbols, kind of symbolic ways of thinking about this process could be to look at the transformation of the caterpillar to the butterfly, which happens in the chrysalis. So in the chrysalis, it's not that the caterpillar sprouts wings and takes off as a butterfly. The whole caterpillar begins to melt down and kind of dissolve into a kind of biotic goop. And there's a handful of imaginal cells that are in the caterpillar, and those cells contain this program for reorganizing the whole mass into something else. This last bid for transcendence, in a sense. And those cells start to propagate themselves, and they're first seen as by the immune system of the dying caterpillar as an invader or an enemy. So they try to fight it. But through the cells, the imaginal cells strengthen themselves by dealing with the immune system, by learning how to overcome it. And then eventually they become so strong and they multiply and they're able to take over that whole mass and create a new species, a butterfly, a pollinating, no longer just eating leaves, now pollinating, now floating, now beautiful. So it could be that this process that's underway, this initiation process, this awakening process, leads us to construct the global human butterfly. And even though it obviously looks extremely difficult at this point to do that, miracles do and can happen all the time. So, I mean, there are some different tools that I use to think about this situation. I think having that evolutionary paradigm is very helpful. One is to look at corporations. If you're part of the anti-globalization movement, you tend to hate corporations, you think they're terrible, and it's true corporations have been tremendously poisonous and destructive, on many levels to the earth. They've also provided, all this incredible comfort and goods that we're now experiencing, which is a new phenomenon in human life. But if you step back, you could look at corporations as artificial life forms, in a sense, that humans constructed. We built them out of financial data, out of brand insignia, out of legal codes and so on. And we took these artificial life forms and we injected them into an artificial game that we created called the stock market. And unfortunately, in this artificial game that we created, we only gave these artificial life forms one prime objective, which is to maximize shareholder value, right? So essentially, a corporation has to just focus on profit by the laws, the underlying laws of the game mechanics that we've created of the stock market. So in a weird way, you can't even really blame a corporation like BP for the Gulf oil spill or these other oil companies for what they're doing around the world, because that's how we've programmed them. And so at some point, I think there's going to have to be this realization, and even in the elite aspects of society, that we need to reinvent the game and reprogram the corporate organism so that its prime directive includes protecting nature, protecting human life, and so on. And that realization could actually happen, once again, at any time, and it's just to begin to spread that and to think about it. So in the book, I look at all the different ways that we could, approach this radical transformation. One of them is obviously the rapid scaling up of, renewable energy, solar, wind. Distributed manufacturing, is another way. Regenerative agriculture, shifting away from industrial food systems back to organic permaculture or no-till agriculture. We actually really have all of the tools and technologies that we would need to make this transition. It's just, unfortunately, our political economic system is obstructing us from what we need to do and keeping us in this kind of state of distraction and consumerism. For me, one of the main problems is the media, which also could be one of the main solutions. That in a sense, people don't recognize that they've been conditioned, that what they think of as their own consciousness and their subjectivity is actually something that's been sort of pre-constructed for them by the media. That from birth, through education and then through media, we're constantly given programming about how we're supposed to act, what relationships are supposed to be like, how we're supposed to relate to authority, what we're supposed to do with our time and our leisure and so on. And so we've been conditioned and programmed to a great degree. Terence McKenna likes to say that culture is our operating system. But once again, I think as we go through this ecological emergency, we're going to be able to start peeling away layers of that conditioning and programming and rediscover who we are. And we're also seeing at the same time kind of these movements of resistance happening all around the world, like the Occupy movement in 2011, like the Arab Spring. And we can see that somehow these movements are not quite coalescing yet. They get to a certain point and then they break down. But that could be kind of almost like the birth tremors, of this new social organism, like that's trying to be born. I mean, I was fascinated by the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York City, where I live, and people were saying, it was very unclear what they were doing. It was just it was a mess. They were protesting, but they didn't have clear objectives. But I think people missed the deeper thing that was happening, and I don't know what happened here in Australia with that movement, but it was actually almost like the attempt to construct a new social organism. Like the Occupy Wall Street was had everything. It was almost like a one-celled organism in a new body or something. It had sustainability areas, meditation, sleeping, research, library, public debate and discussion, direct democracy. It was much more about the process of constructing a new social organism than it was about protesting the current system. That was just kind of its appearance. And once again, I think as we go deeper into this next few years, we're going to see more social experiments, and people are going to have to take them, more to heart and participate in them more deeply. So that's some of my thought. I could take it in many directions, but I think we're almost out of time. And I only brought a few books. If you want to find out more about my work, once again, you can watch the film 2012 Time for Change. It's on Vimeo. And my books are available through Amazon. And I really appreciate being here. It's my first time in Australia. It was a very long flight. And it was very nice to meet all of you. And I'll be hanging out and chatting too.